Okay.
Okay. All right. Nice to meet you, Redeemed Zoomer. Um,
Nice to meet you, young Anglican.
yeah, thanks. We had a little conversation in my comments section on YouTube for a little bit where he saw my video, which was super cool, where I addressed some of the ideas of Reconquista. And I think here we're going to talk about where we agree, where we disagree, where we might be able to work together, where we might differ on strategy and all those kinds of things. If you want, can you give a summary maybe of Reconquista for the potential people who don't necessarily understand?
Yeah. So Reconquista is necessary because the mainstream or mainline Protestant churches have largely drifted away from the beliefs they were founded on. And this applies not just to churches. It starts in the churches, but also to a lot of the institutions in the West, especially like universities and stuff. They have drifted from the beliefs that they were founded on. So Reconquista is an effort to sort of recapture these institutions for God's kingdom and to transform them, rather than simply running away from them and trying to start our own institutions or brand new ones. Because that's kind of what conservative Christians, so to speak, have tried for the last like 100 years or so, and so far it hasn't. I would argue that it has just been like a joke, honestly. The what they've done compared to what the original institutions were.
Yeah, and I actually tend to agree with the idea that modern Christians, especially conservative Christians, are very quick to schism and to separate when they don't like what someone's teaching. I mean, I'm in the ACNA, which is the conservative main Anglican denomination in the United States. But there are people, if you find online, like continuing Anglicans who think that the ACNA is too liberal or too moderate or something, and they need to split off, and they have their own very small denomination. And I think that's really bad. And I think especially if you read the early church fathers, they talk about schism kind of like it's like killing something. It's obviously as Protestants we believe like the same with killing. Sometimes it's self-defense. It's okay. You can excuse it, but you have to have a really good reason to do what you're gonna do before you do it. You know what I mean? It can't just be kind of like this guy kind of bothered me about this issue, before you kind of cut yourself off.
Yeah, that's a really good way to put it. I've never heard it like that. It's like schism really is like killing. You're killing something, and of course there are cases in which killing is justified,
Mm-hmm.
but it's also really bad if it becomes the norm. And in
Yeah.
Protestantism, it has definitely become the norm.
Yeah, and I think even if you can say sometimes killing is useful, it's not necessarily the best way to propagate true doctrine. Too right. We shouldn't. I think most of us would agree that the periods in Christian history where people were killing other Christians over issues of theology was bad. So in the same way, schism would probably be, in my opinion, looked at the same way. But of course, I'm a part of the ACNA and not a part of the Episcopal Church in the United States. Of course, there's a little bit of a question now, and I brought this up in my Kigali video, but which of the two American denominations is, the historic one versus the one that's the most recognized? But I think even you and I can maybe agree that there's something valuable regardless of the international recognition to the physical institutions that the Episcopal Church, or in my instance, might have control over, that the ACNA doesn't.
It's yeah. Now a lot of people think I'm being too materialistic in saying, well, we need to recapture these like beautiful buildings, these like seminaries and stuff. But really, it's that there were generations and generations of families donating a lot of their assets to these institutions just for the institutions to abandon what they donated to and for the conservatives to just be like, forget this, we're starting something brand new. So I think giving up on these institutions is disrespectful to the hundreds of years of generations of families who donated to this. Like the reason the mainline has so much more resources than their evangelical counterparts is because of how deeply rooted they are in the culture and the society, and because of all the donations they've had. So that's why it's like I'm not opposed to like house churches if you're in China where there really is no established church there, and those the house churches are like the seeds. But that's why I'm very opposed to people in America where there are established churches just going off and doing their own thing.
Yeah, I think that was a good. You made a post about that, and I think I totally agreed with the argument there. And as an Anglican, I feel like I meet a lot of Anglicans who really agree with that sentiment. I think there's a streak in maybe evangelical conservative Christianity in America, which doesn't think of these things as valuable, and they have a kind of lacking kingdom mindset. And what we do need to do is bring that back. Maybe we can start with where we might disagree, because I totally agree with the goals and the aims, but as someone who spent a lot of time in maybe my mainline denomination, which was the Episcopal Church, and wrestled with these issues, I have lots of my fiance's family grew up Episcopal, and I have a lot of friends that are still Episcopalian, and all this stuff. And I think that there are, and I guess I just got into a good conversation with an Episcopalian about orthodoxy and that kind of stuff. And for instance, even one of the churches that I've been to recently, they just got a woman preacher, and a lot of the congregants stopped going. So there are people even in the Episcopal Church who have maybe more conservative opinions, but they have a difficulty, I guess, voicing it or enforcing it.
That is the big thing. There are a lot of conservative mainliners that
Yeah.
don't get recognized. I think it's good that you and I both have a very kingdom mindset. I'm sure,
Yeah.
given that you're Anglican and you use the word kingdom, that you've read a lot of N.T. Wright.
Yeah.
So
Yes.
I think if you do have a kingdom mindset, then we, like you said, we both agree that Reconquista needs to be the end goal. We might disagree on how to get there. Like,
Yeah.
correct me if I'm wrong, but your strategy seems to be more one of like a temporary retreat and regrouping so that eventually later we can retake some stuff. Whereas my mindset is just like never surrender. Winston Churchill, stick it out till the end, even if you're
Yeah.
bleeding, just keep fighting, keep fighting.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it's important that we agree on that.
Yeah. And I mean, I have my daily prayer and Bible reading, and this morning, providentially, my reading was Joshua 7, where the Israelites lose a battle, and then because they retreat, God rebukes them.
Yeah.
So there's there's definitely some consequence, I think, to having a retreatist mindset. What I
Yeah.
would say, however, is especially with, in my opinion, specifically the Episcopal Church. I don't know if you've heard about the Diocese of Florida controversies and things like this, but
I
there,
watched your video about it.
yeah, for those who don't know, there's a bishop in the Diocese of Florida who's been, I think it's been like 2 years or 3 years or something, where he keeps getting voted to become the bishop, but he refuses to do gay weddings and has like a quote history of LGBTQ like discrimination and things like that, and there are institutions in the Episcopal Church, for instance, what's called the Deputies of Color, which is like this like organizational hierarchy thing, which has to approve of all of these bishops' appointments, and they're not approving of him. And there, I would say, my concern is that there is active organs in mainline churches deliberately trying to, I don't know if this is true in the PCUSA, but it is in the Episcopal Church, that are actively trying to prevent a Reconquista, and maybe a way that makes it maybe more impractical. Or what do you think about that?
I mean, I know that there are a lot of forces that are opposed to this because it is true. A lot of people in these mainline churches do not care about the church. They only care about making sure their agenda takes over the church. But I think it's really like standing up to a bully. If a bully is like saying, "Oh, you can't sit at this lunch table," and even if they look really intimidating, it might be scary. But what I know people are soft these days, but what parents in the old days would say is, no, you got to stand up to the bully. It's like
Yeah.
they can smell fear. And as a former leftist, as a former progressive, progressives have this strategy of making themselves look stronger than they are. Um, when you really look into it, you realize the emperor has no clothes, because it's like conservatives are like, I'm so scared to like attend this mainline church. I'm gonna be, and then the people that are there are like three old lesbians. It's like these. I'm serious. These
Yeah.
young tough guys are like, I'm too scared to go. I might be influenced by them.
Yeah.
So
No, I
it's
think
like
that's true. I think, and
I
yeah.
think they could smell fear.
Yeah. I mean, part of my concern is, and a lot of, I remember I had a conversation with a conservative friend of mine who pointed out that I think 60% of Americans, when polled, say your gender is determined by your sex at birth. And people will say, oh, it's really popular, this opinion, but you wouldn't know that just from like watching the news or doing all these things. And conservative opinions kind of fall into this, silent majority trope. But sometimes I'm worried that the same thing is true here. But like if you look at history, which I brought this up with you before, but I was a history major in undergrad. Like the original usage of the term silent majority was Richard Nixon, and he basically argued like, these hippies, they are the minority and they shouldn't have any institutional power compared to the majority of Americans. But if you look at history after Nixon, the hippies won, not Nixon, in my opinion. So
Yeah.
there's definitely, um, I don't know. It's hard to explain why small minorities of progressives always seem to win these institutional battles, and I think if you look at politics, maybe more so than the church, because I do agree in the church there's a lot of retreatism, but if you look at like, I don't know, broader culture and society, if you look at like Nixon and the Reagan Revolution, it would seem like this would be like the moment of Reconquista of the culture, and then it kind of falls apart. Do you have any thoughts on maybe why that institutional imbalance might be?
Yeah. There have been a lot of conservative reactionary movements in politics,
Mm-hmm.
but even so, it wasn't all that institutional because politics depends on raw numbers. We never really saw conservatives focus on like academic excellence. It was mostly just winning elections. Elections depend on numbers.
Yeah.
So conservatives often do have the numbers, but that keeps shrinking the more institutions the progressives take over. That's why I say the way to impact the culture and spread God's kingdom is not just converting as many individuals as possible until you have a majority, because that's
Mm-hmm.
already what's been tried. The conservatives basically gave the arts and schools over to the liberals. It's like, oh, art school, that's a liberal thing. Yeah, well, that ended up influencing the culture.
Yeah.
They were just like focusing on the politics, but politics is just downstream from culture, really.
Very
Another
much.
thing I would say about these, why this didn't work before, is I don't think pure conservatism can ever win.
Mm-hmm.
That's why even though I am what people would call a conservative, I think we need to not think of ourselves as people just trying to go back to the past because you can't go back to the past. Conservatives need to provide a vision. Like conservatives are really good at saying what they're against, not very good at saying what they're for. So a lot of times it's just like, oh, this wokeness is so bad. And it's like, yeah, you can get a reaction against the wokeness, but it's not going to last if you don't have a vision for the future. And Christianity has always been progressive in that we've been progressing towards the kingdom of God. I say this as someone who's not post millennial, by the way.
Yeah.
I'm just saying that's Christianity.
Yeah.
And this conservatism, it has always just been a sort of a vague notion of things are getting bad. We need to stop the things getting bad.
Mm-hmm.
But it's like, what are we doing instead? So the Reconquista isn't just like, hey, there's gays in the church. That's bad. No, it's not about that at all. The like pride symbols are just a symptom of it. It's about we need to progress the church towards scripture and towards what the confessions say.
Yeah.
And I think I was talking with this conservative Lutheran guy who's like halfway on board with the Reconquista. He says if we do a Reconquista, we need to return to confessionalism because a lot of the problems happened with sort of trying to reduce the gospel and oversimplify the gospel. What do you think about that?
Oh, I definitely agree. I get into arguments a lot of times on Anglican spaces, even with conservative Anglicans, because there's this kind of, I'm going to butcher this, but like some should, all may, none must kind of attitude a lot in Anglicanism. And people even take that with the 39 Articles a lot. I think I see this a lot in Anglo-Catholic spaces, but also in very liberal Anglican spaces where they kind of say, well, we don't really, the 39 Articles are just suggestions. But I actually tend to agree that I think confessionalism is very good for theology, for catechism. I try to be a voice in Anglican spaces where the complaint I hear a lot, and I get a lot of comments that like, what's the Anglican position on this? And Anglicans' knee-jerk reaction tends to be, there is no Anglican position, but that's not true. I mean, if you read Hooker and Cranmer, they have answers to these questions, and they're, fundamental, and there are answers in the 39 Articles. I usually try to reference people to the ACNA Catechism, which I think is very helpful, but because I think being able to give people answers on these things, whether or not you know that they're 100% true, are actually better for theological formation than just saying, who knows, nobody knows, whatever. And I think that a lot of a good example I give is if you've ever seen Rhett and Link, they have a really good deconversion story, like they have like 2 hours of them talking about why they stopped being Christians. And a lot of it, in my opinion, is boiled down to they had a question and no one could answer it. And I
Yeah,
think,
that's a good
yeah,
thing.
yeah,
What
and
I
yeah,
what I sometimes say is that liberals theologically liberal people want like questions with no answers, and fundamentalists want answers with no questions.
Yeah.
Having a question and an answer, that's called catechism.
Yeah.
You won't find much of that in either fundamentalist or liberal circles. So the ACNA, 100% more power to them for being, confessional and sticking to catechisms. And even if I'm sure you'll tell me there are some problems, but
Hmm.
it's very good. As far as Protestantism goes, I know it's very good.
Hmm.
My problem with institutions like the ACNA or the PCA for Presbyterians like me is that institutions have always been inseparable from the Protestant identity. It's what makes the magisterial Protestants, meaning Lutherans, Anglicans, and Calvinists, distinct from the radical Reformation people like the Baptists, your non-denominationals, is this institutionalism. Because during the Reformation, they did not run away from the institutions and make new ones. They reformed the institutions. They just separated the institutions from the authority of the Pope. But Oxford went from being a institution under the authority of the Pope to institution under the authority of the Anglican Church. But they did not run away from the institutions. They were always very institutional. And now, as good as the intellectual theology of places like the OPC or the ACNA or the as good as those things might be, it will never really be what it was without the institutions. And a lot of the theology has to do with the institutions. Like there is a Calvinist theology of art and music and politics. How does that come into effect if we don't have any institutions to express that theology through? So that's why it's often hard to tell the difference between a PCA Presbyterian church and a Reformed Baptist church. Because if Protestants no longer have institutions, they start to look a lot like the Anabaptists. And that's what we see in like the ACNA OPC. You go into the vast majority of those churches; those don't look like traditional Presbyterian or Anglican churches because they can't. I'm sure they'd love to if they could. They have to like rent out classrooms, but it's like everyone thinks I'm being like too materialistic, but it's an outward sign of the inward reality
Hmm.
that Protestantism has lost its identity.
Yeah. I think what I would say is a lot of. I was just thinking this where I think there's a Dr. Jordan Cooper video where he complains that there's not a lot of Protestants in politics, and especially conservative politics. He's like, why are all these guys, Matt Walsh, Michael Knowles, why are they all Catholic? And I think a big part of that is that Catholics have a better sense, because they still have their institutions, have a better sense of participating in society. Uh,
100%.
yeah, than I think a lot of Protestants do. And I think, like, if you look at Doug Wilson, for example, I think he's a good example of a guy who's actively talking about issues that are, kingdom mindset in a way. But to another, I think he just released his book Mere Christendom, which I love Doug Wilson. I don't mean this to be a total criticism of Doug Wilson, but I think he does have this kind of like, I don't know, like the culture is just lost kind of thing. Like we're not gonna be able to do anything in the culture, and
Well, according to people like Doug Wilson, if a woman breathes in church, it's already fallen to liberalism.
yeah,
Kidding.
I agree.
Kidding.
I think that there's a little bit of a defeatism there, which we are literally, I would say, commanded not to have in the Bible. Like that's again,
Yeah.
Joshua 7, I think is a good example. But and for instance, when people, I think a lot of Catholics, in my opinion, misquote the gates of hell will never prevail against the church, because what that means is the gates are like the boundary of hell. So the entrance to hell, we will go into it and destroy it. The church can like actively crusade, maybe not maybe a comparable word to Reconquista, but like you can conquer these places you think you can't. That's kind of what Jesus is saying in those lines. Like,
Yes.
yeah, you won't fail with God. Anything is possible, and I think living that out is definitely true. However, I do like another example though I would give from the book of Judges would be that there are places where the Israelites fail. There's think a section that's infamous because atheists quote it a lot where the Israelites try to conquer a valley, but there's iron chariots in the valley, and even though it says God is with them, they lose the battle, and they just lose that valley, and they never return. And I'm not sure if that is supposed to say like they were doing it wrong, but it does literally say like the technology of our enemies was superior to the technology of the Israelites, so they lose this battle in a way. And I think the same thing might be able to be said about, in my opinion, some mainline institutions. I'm not sure if, again, I don't know too much about the PCUSA, and I know that you had your 95 Theses, which had a lot of, from what I understand, good responses and things like that. And like I've said before, I think there are a lot of people in Episcopalian context, just from my personal experience, who are very lowercase o orthodox, and they kind of need a shepherd a little bit. But it does seem like there's a lot of institutional technology designed specifically to prevent Reconquista that I think might end up, I don't know, like wasting kingdom energy in a way. Like I can't help but think like what if all the people in Florida, in my opinion, obviously the Episcopal Church has all these rules about how you can't leave, like the physical church can't leave the denomination. But what if all these people in the Florida diocese who have consistently tried to get, internal reform in the Episcopal Church, what if they kind of, gave all that tithing money to an organization that was maybe had a better, I don't know, more accurate biblical kingdom mindset in the ACNA. But I do, yeah, I guess maybe I would like some of your thoughts on the fact that, if you're tithing in a maybe mainline denomination that's actively thinks Christianity to some extent is some like vestige of sexism and racism and all that kind of stuff. You're kind of giving them your money, and you're kind of allowing the, I don't know, the heterodox opinions and heresies, frankly, to kind of propagate.
Yeah, well, I would say that retreatism, that's the real form of allowing the heterodox opinions to propagate. A lot of conservatives have this idea that if they storm out, then the liberals are going to it's going to hurt their feelings and they're going to reconsider their way. No, they're going to be like, good riddance. Don't let the door hit you on the way out.
Yeah.
It's like if you leave these institutions, they're still going to be there. They're still going to be using the Lord's name in vain. And they're still going to be using the resources of faithful Christians to do so. Remember, the Episcopal Church especially has a huge endowment. What do we know about Episcopalians? Generations of rich white people.
Yeah.
They're still using the resources of faithful Christians to promote heresy. And no matter how much tithing you do for like small like ACNA or other Protestant offshoot denominations, you're never going to rebuild what they have in their power. So it's like they are still going to be using the weapons of Christians against Christianity until you retake it. Now, you mentioned the Old Testament. Now, that one verse in Judges, that is a problematic verse. There are those dark passages, the Puritans refer to, passages that you're not quite sure how to interpret.
Yeah.
It's generally not good to base your doctrine on a dark passage. Just like it always gets weird when people have like theories about the Nephilim or whatever.
That's true. I've met people who go off about the Nephilim, and I'm like,
for the most part in the Old Testament, when the Israelites have faith, God makes them win. When the Israelites do not have faith, God does not make them win. Of course, the battle was physical back then, it's spiritual now. But the battle for the mainline denominations is a deep spiritual battle. There's this one lady in my church who speaks in tongues, and she said she saw a demon in our church. And I am not charismatic, but I believe her.
Yeah.
Revelation seems to imply there's angels stationed at every church. So it's like, if you go into your old, dusty Episcopal church in any given town, there's probably a spiritual war going on there behind the scenes. There's probably angels and demons having a lightsaber duel while Pastor Susan is giving her little spiel.
Yeah.
So it really is a battle. And I really think retreatism at the core is a lack of faith.
Yeah.
And God always punishes people for a lack of faith. And I think the lack of influence that these offshoot denominations have on broader Christianity is because it's a lack of faith. I'm not trying to speak for God, but the fact that it's not really gone anywhere could be considered like a punishment even. I'm not saying it is. I'm just saying it could be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think American history is so interesting with the idea of mainline churches, because other countries like England or the Netherlands had this was the institutional church. Like there was just one, and it was the one associated with all the institutions, and it was kind of, I guess you could say, it's more of an obvious battleground. But in the United States, I think, if you look into the history of a lot of these mainline denominations, they kind of came together at different points and kind of diverged at different points. So some of the old churches, for instance, in like a Methodist church, like when they were originally built, they weren't part of the United Methodist Church. but they were part of some random denomination. And as there was kind of a, I don't know, I guess you could say a proliferation, a flourishing. It's usually during the Gilded Age that a lot of these denominations came together, and kind of this attitude of, I guess, public evangelization of a culture that people were worried was losing Christianity. I mean, imagine if they saw America today, but there was this, I guess you could say, real need and desire to kind of have a conversation with the culture through this obvious institution for the idea that promoting Christianity was public and acceptable. And I don't know if you've kind of, I don't know if, I mean, for instance, I'm in law school right now. And a book that I read that really motivated me to go to law school was, I'm forgetting what it's called. I'll maybe send a link to it or maybe put it in the description later. But basically he argues that since actually the decision where Mormons were not allowed to practice polygamy, we've basically lost the right to religious freedom in the United States, because since that decision, even though he generally agrees with that, I think he's actually an Episcopalian writing in the 90s, but he actually agrees, obviously, that polygamy is bad, but that because of that decision, if you look at a lot of the subsequent rulings on religious freedom in the United States, that they've totally lost all of their ability to argue that religions, I guess, have a special space in culture where they're allowed to propagate their opinions and say these things. For instance, there's cases where Jehovah's Witnesses are prosecuted for not giving blood donations to their children that he talks about. He actually, in the 90s, the Episcopal Church already was ordaining women, but he argues that there's a exception for churches specifically that are allowed to discriminate based on sex for their employees, but he argues that that's likely going to go away eventually. That there's this kind of active secular culture that prevents the kind of, I don't know, transmission from institutions of Christian concepts into the culture. It's kind of basically illegal, or that the courts will always kind of go against you. Now, I think our current Supreme Court is a lot more open to religious freedom than the court was in the 90s. But I guess it's hard not to have this kind of retreatist attitude, is basically what I'm getting at, where there's this hard wall, I would say, that our society puts between saying overt Christian stuff. Like, I can't help but wonder if the reason all the mainline churches ended up becoming liberal was because people in those institutional churches who did practice and preach orthodox biblical theology literally were punished by their interaction with the very culture itself, because the culture does not allow for this kind of orthodox biblical theology. And so maybe some might argue that in interaction with the culture as itself is hazardous to biblical theology.
Here's how I'd push back on that. Two words: Roman Catholicism.
Yeah.
Like you already said, basically every, what we would say, conservative cultural victory in the last 60 years, especially the overturning of Roe v. Wade and religious freedom in the Supreme Court, has been spearheaded by Roman Catholics. I would say the only group that is having a positive cultural influence, a strong positive cultural influence, is the Roman Catholic Church, because they're the only established church in America that still holds to their biblical principles. And I know a lot of people who might be like anti-Catholic. You don't strike me as someone who's all that anti-Catholic.
No, quite frankly, no. A lot of Anglicans aren't, but it's true. I think it's pretty easy for Anglicans to say Catholics are Christians. They're doing a lot of good stuff, while we disagree on like justification. Anglicans and Catholics
Jordan
don't
Cooper,
disagree on stuff.
You mentioned that video. Jordan Cooper said, like, why aren't Protestants in politics? I think he more specifically said, why aren't Protestants in our cultural conversations? Because there are a lot of Protestants in politics, but like they're either people who are Protestant in name only, like Hillary Clinton, or she is baptized Methodist, or they're people who are like evangelicals, like half the Republican Party, who are definitely faithful Christians.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
So I wouldn't say there's a shortage of Protestants in politics, but there's absolutely a shortage of Protestants in the cultural conversations. Evangelical Protestants, they don't care about cultural institutions. They're not in the cultural conversations. They're not academic enough to engage in that sort of thing, just statistically. I know there's a lot who would like to, but their institutions, they don't really have those sort of institutions. Mainline Protestants definitely could in theory, but they have just tied their beliefs to whatever the secular culture says. That's why in 1930s Germany, the liberal churches actually supported the Nazis.
Yeah.
And the Karl Barth, who was relatively conservative, he was the one who spoke out against that. Now that the culture says diversity, equity, and inclusion, that's just what the mainline churches say. So I think if we want to get Protestants back into the cultural conversation, Reconquista is the only way. But what do you think about that?
Yeah, I generally totally agree. The example that I'll give, and actually, there's a very interesting series of videos on YouTube by an account called basically just World War II, which talks about they do World War II day by day, and for like they've been doing it for years now, basically. Like this day in World War II, I think it was like 82 years ago today. But they have a good series about the relationship between the Catholic Church and the Nazis, and there's actually a plot by the Catholic Church to assassinate Hitler, which is super interesting.
There
And
is.
yeah, yeah, I know it's very cool, or not
I
necessarily.
was told by
Yeah.
my sort of liberal high school that the Catholic Church supported the Nazis. Is that true?
Well, no. I mean, anyone who has I would say, a shallow understanding even of the Holocaust would point out that lots of Catholic priests were actually interned in concentration camps.
Oh yeah, one of my ancestors was. So
Yeah, and were killed. I mean, I'm forgetting the saint, but there was a saint who gave his life for a Catholic priest gave his life for other people interned in concentration camps. Um, and the example I gave where they tried to assassinate Hitler was actually a Catholic guy who got the okay because he sent a letter to the Pope. But it's kind of a stretch. But I agree. I think you can actually. My only reason of bringing that up is it's an example of an institution giving power to people who are trying to affect the culture for Christ. But then my example, my concern is that it doesn't seem like. I mean, there were a lot of Protestants who opposed Hitler, but there wasn't that kind of, I guess, institutional power to do the same thing as I would say the Catholics maybe had in World War II. For instance, Karl Barth says a lot of stuff, and there were like partisans in Nazi Germany who were devout Protestants, of course. But it wasn't until that wasn't what took down Hitler in a way. Maybe that wasn't what destroyed the culture. It was a foreign power, the United States, the Soviet Union, Great Britain coming together, and from the outside they reconquered Nazi Germany in the same way that the example I would give with Asturias during the Reconquista. But in my video I brought up Saint Aidan, who is a monk who re-evangelized Great Britain. He did it from an island, literally called Lindisfarne, which eventually later is sacked by Vikings. But he builds a new monastery, to retake the original institutions which were corrupted. And so I think that model does re-emerge constantly in Christian history and in history in general, of this kind of like, you have to retreat for a moment to regroup. But then the ultimate goal, which I think you're totally right in saying that a lot of conservative Christians, they don't even think about the eventual Reconquista. They're just concerned about the regrouping and doing their own thing, and having a separate space. But yeah, I guess maybe my thought was that the regrouping period, the kind of secondary organizations, the other institutions, I can't help but think about Calvin Robinson, for instance. I think he's a
I
part of.
love Calvin Robinson.
Yeah.
I should be having a conversation with him in a few weeks, but
Oh, that's great. I love Calvin Robinson also. I think he's great. Maybe my thought is, I mean, he was going to join the Church of England, but was literally barred because of the stuff he had said. So he definitely, I would say, prioritizes institutions, and he's trying his hardest.
he knows how valuable they are.
Yeah, but he wasn't allowed. So now he's, I think, technically a part of the ACNA, but like in England. And there's lots of complicated polity stuff there. And obviously, I don't think Presbyterians have the same kind of view of maybe apostolic succession that Anglicans do. But there is something to. I think Anglicanism has Reconquista built in inherently, because we have to think that we are descended from, validly ordained bishops in a way. I mean, the ACNA has this like infamous chart of how Foley Beach, who's our archbishop, can trace his lineage back to St. Peter and St. James from the laying on of hands. Mm-hmm. But I think maybe that notion of apostolic succession is also this kind of institutional succession. Maybe you can speak on the idea that Christians have always kind of thought that these institutions do matter, and that we kind of need to be focused on retaking them at some point.
Yeah, what you're saying is interesting. So I don't know what that would look like in the modern world. Are we just gonna ask Uganda to sort of like invade the US?
Yeah.
I mean, if things keep going the way they're going, it's like I could actually see. Um, I've I don't think I've publicly predicted this, but I've always thought that, in 200 years, Africa is going to be the most developed part of the world because of how much Africa is the only part of the world where classical Protestantism is flourishing.
Yeah.
Like we just saw, an ecumenical council was held in Kigali.
Yeah.
And as even though I kind of wish it didn't have to happen, it's cool. So um, I guess what you're saying is like 300 years from now, there could be a reconquista of some other Christian civilization that emerges outside of the West, retaking the West.
Mm-hmm.
I know my sort of alt right followers are not going to like that, but come on,
I know.
guys.
Yeah.
Your dream society has died, so
Yeah.
I'm
I
sorry.
think there's some truth to that too. I can't help but feel like people who kind of cling very strongly to the idea of race or culture as something fundamental to Christianity. Even though I'm totally supporter of material culture, Western civilization was good. I'm not saying that it wasn't. I think that they are kind of missing a core gospel, a core element of the gospel, which is the motif of like the guys you thought were going to do this aren't. So like and this isn't going to go the way you guys thought it was going to. I think that's one of the, as a former Jew, I think one of the more prescient parts of the conversion of early Christianity is that the people who were supposed to receive Jesus reject him in large scale, not wholesale. Obviously, lots of Jews follow Jesus, but it's the little brother, the Gentiles, who actually
Yeah.
cling more closely to Christianity. And I think the same thing is kind of happening a little bit now with Africa. Obviously, as part of the ACNA, the Anglican world is 85% global South, and
Yeah.
these people are very confessional, and they're very, they care about 39 articles. They care about biblical orthodoxy. They care about all these cultural institutions, and I can't help but think that some of these external institutions, I can't help but think about like even just demographic statistics show that mainline churches, people that go to these churches, they just don't have any children, versus Africa, there's a population boom. I
Yeah.
wonder if there's some thoughts
Did you
on
say
that.
that you're a former Jew, or are you saying
No, I was born Jewish. I
Oh,
think I brought
really?
this up in some videos. Yeah, I was raised Jewish,
Nice.
and came to Christ like 3 years ago, more or less.
God bless.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
My dad was raised Jewish. I wasn't really, but
yeah,
so yeah, we know that the a lot of times God's people are not who we expect. So right now, I would say that I would agree that there is something great about Anglo-Saxon culture, but I would say that right now Nigeria is starting to exemplify it better than Great Britain, because I know they say it's like colonization, but no, it's like every cultures have colonized and diffused each other's ideas since the beginning of time. So a lot of the good aspects of Anglicanism and Anglo-Saxon culture are now present outside of England. So I agree that there are ways in which we can just have like outside societies develop and then maybe sort of recolonize the societies that colonized them. But
yeah,
that takes a while.
yeah.
I see the seeds of something really great in Africa, but it's still going to be like 200 years
Hmm.
away after we're dead before that really starts to flourish. So
Yeah.
if we want to see kingdom flourishing now,
Hmm.
I'm not sure what to do because I don't really see any way to preserve these fundamental assets of the kingdom now other than Reconquista. Um, I would, people have said, oh, what would make you change your mind on Reconquista? I'll change my mind on Reconquista if I am convinced that there is a better way to basically preserve and build upon the assets of the kingdom and conserve classical Protestantism. Because like the reason the ACNA split, it's like I know it's the Episcopal structure is harder than the Presbyterian structure, but when the OPC split off 100 years ago, their mindset was we're just preserving our doctrines. But fast forward 100 years, the OPC is still just as tiny as it was and has had zero influence over the culture or Christianity. When the PCA split off in like the 70s, at first they tried to call themselves the continuing church, but I honestly think that was just like something they said to themselves to hide the fact that they're really not the continuing church. They split off from the continuing church, and the PCA just ended up becoming influenced by broader evangelicalism. So all these efforts by people splitting off, they're always, the intention is always to preserve what's left of the Protestant heritage, but that's never how it actually goes. And the only few sorry, the only few denominations I would say, conservative denominations, that still manage to preserve the Protestant heritage, like the LCMS or the RPCNA, are technically mainline genealogically. They're not liberal, but those are the institutions that never really, I mean, the denominations that never really split off from their institutions.
Yeah, I was gonna ask you actually about maybe the LCMS, and people say the SBC maybe kind of counts as a mainline denomination a little bit because
Kinda.
yeah, and they had their conservative revolutions. I think the Lutherans was in like the 19th century, but the SBC was in like the 70s or the 80s or whatever. And there's people point
Mhm.
out that the SBC used to have official statements against biblical inerrancy, and now those are removed. There was definitely kind of a bit of a Reconquista in the SBC. But from in my experience, from what I've noticed in the LCMS, if you look at the, I think Ready to Harvest has a good video on the LCMS history of the LCMS where he talks about how it was kind of a top-down change, right? So in the LCMS, they started kicking out professors who taught liberal theology, and in the SBC, it was a leadership conservative revolution where they started again from the top down. I guess maybe my concern with the Reconquista is that it seems maybe bottom up, right? Like let's all go to churches and let's attend regularly, and then slowly it'll kind of work its way up the ladder, I guess.
I think that's more possible for a Presbyterian church because Presbyterian government is kind of a bottom up hierarchy.
Yeah, true.
Because what happened in my specific Presbyterian church is it was the one conservative church in our extremely liberal presbytery. And it started to shift liberal once just some people moved up from New York City, started attending our church, and almost made it a progressive church. And me and a few other guys basically stopped that from happening. So in our church, and I think it's true in most Presbyterian churches, it really is bottom up. I acknowledge that it's much harder to do a Reconquista in the Episcopal Church, but at the same time, it's like high risk, high reward. If you do somehow manage to, and with God all things are possible, it would yield a much greater reward because then you really could enforce the Reconquista much harder.
Yeah, I know. I think I wonder if they're, like I said before, I know a lot of Episcopalians who are theologically conservative congregants. What I think that the disconnect between maybe more young conservatives are and older conservatives, especially these kind of institutional minded conservatives, because in my mind maybe this is just my personal experience, but it seems like silent generation boomers, older boomers can be very conservative, but they kind of have this, especially conservative boomers, kind of have this live and let live. Like even though this is my opinion, I can't force it on you. Opinion.
No, it's my opinion. I mean,
Yeah.
yeah, I know what you mean.
Yeah, and the like, and the same thing with even Gen X conservatives who tend to be more libertarian even than boomers,
Absolutely.
and then our generation growing up maybe more in this period in the aftermath of that attitude in the conservative age. We're like we're not conceding anything actually. Like we're
Yeah.
not going to allow all this stuff to happen. I think there's a lot more um, backlash in our generation to active attempts to take the culture away from conservative institutions because we realize what it's like growing up. And I know you say this all the time about growing up in New York. Same thing for me growing up where I grew up in northern Jersey. Like the public schools are just full of kind of indoctrination, I think, a lot of
Yeah.
times. And we kind of want to maybe reverse it. And what I would say is there are a lot of conservative Episcopalians who are kind of that first attitude where they're conservative, but they don't think it's their right to, for instance, say that that the denomination shouldn't allow gay marriage or that the denomination shouldn't allow this kind of stuff. And so maybe that would be my difference between, like, I think it's not difficult to find conservative Episcopalian congregations, but whether or not those congregations would be willing to, I don't know, kind of enforce doctrinal change at a higher level seems, I think I'm a little skeptical of that idea. Or I don't know
I
if you've
see
run into
that
something.
mindset in boomer conservatives as well, especially in my church. And I also think that mindset that boomer conservatives have is this everything will be fine mindset. Everything will be fine in the end. It's like, okay, okay, George, just because your generation was a bunch of degenerate idiots and then grew out of it doesn't mean we are.
Yeah.
It's like when I used to like show this, radical gender ideology to my parents, what they said is, "Oh, that's just a phase. Our
Yeah.
generation had that phase when we were in college. They'll grow out of it. They'll be conservative." But no, that's what happened for them. It's not what happens for us.
Yeah.
In my church, I have seen a lot of people who are conservative but feel like it's not their place to speak out. You are 100,000% right
Yeah.
about that. I think what you need to do is you need to make people aware of how bad it is, especially the older generation conservatives who are very oblivious to how bad it is. It's like um, I once told some older people, some older Christians, how what it was like in our generation. And they're like, "What do you mean your classmates don't go to church?" It's like they are actually surprised by that.
Yeah.
And I was my Instagram page, Redeemed Zoomer, got started originally when I told one of the elders in my church that how depressed a lot of Gen Z is, and he was like, "Well, if they're depressed, why don't they talk to their parents about it?" And I was like, "Kids in our generation are taught to hate their parents."
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, a lot of them don't grow up in two-parent households. These kind of
Yeah,
issues, they have consequences. I think, like, in my experience, like, there's uh, my fiance's Episcopalian grandfather. I'll talk to him, and he completely agrees on these things. Oh, this is horrible. This is whatever. But he doesn't necessarily feel like it's his, I don't know, duty. Or I think this is the thing is he feels like it's an imposition. But I'd rather phrase it as this is your obligation. This is your
oh yes,
responsibility. This is like these are this is, you're doing good by promoting these beliefs, and it's almost. I mean, I don't want to say anything too strong. I don't think they don't believe in the gospel, but like this kind of lack of desire to evangelize betrays maybe like an insecurity in the gospel. Like if this is true, if this is the truest thing that's ever been said, and if it's really the good news, like you can't not evangelize. You can't not give these opinions to younger generations. You can't not push it forward, I guess, into society, into the culture, into these public
yeah.
spaces.
Given how America used to be, or at least the vision of the past people have, conservatives are comfort addicts, and that's why they are so they're either intolerant of being around anything they disagree with, or they think it's just not their place to say anything. Either way, they're avoiding conflict. Either
Yeah,
way,
yeah. I think that's true. I mean, I guess to get back to because obviously I I think we're agreeing on a lot of stuff, but obviously we disagree on whether or not still it's a good idea to participate in mainline congregations. And I know you have a lot of nuance actually on when or when not to attend a mainline church.
yeah.
Maybe you could go into that more. Maybe where would you recommend somebody start attending a mainline church? When in what situations wouldn't you recommend that somebody start attending a mainline church?
So I have like 5 stages of progressivism. I have a video explaining that. Real quick, stage one is Christian guilt, where you feel like Christianity is bad historically, needs to change. Stage two is a disordered focus. This is a lot of the mainline churches where they do believe the essentials of Christianity, but they don't talk about it enough. Stage three is where people start to deny things in the scriptures, start to be like open and affirming and stuff, but still, and usually universalist, but still believe in the resurrection and the deity of Christ so they could still be saved despite their grave errors. Stage four is where you get into actual heresy, where you deny the divinity of Christ. And stage five is where you're a literal atheist. And all 5 of those stages exist within the main line. So I would only advocate people sort of swarm to the churches in stages 0, 1, and 2. Now, if you are in a church at stage 3, 4, or 5 and think God has still called you to that, I'd recommend staying in there still. I mean, I wouldn't recommend. I'd say you follow your conscience.
Mm-hmm.
I would say you still could be in one of those churches if you feel like God is calling you to there. Um, I generally wouldn't recommend someone not in one of those churches start going to one. But God always does preserve a remnant, even in like the most liberal UCC churches, and UCC is at a level where even I would say, yeah, we shouldn't bother.
Yeah.
Even in those churches, there's still some old ladies who are like, well, someone needs to preach the gospel to these people. So I'm like,
Mm-hmm.
Jesus said, wherever 2 or more are gathered in my name, I'm there with them.
Mm-hmm.
It's like a lot of these radical retreatists that I've talked to, they don't really seem to believe that. They seem to think that a woman as a pastor is like kryptonite to Jesus.
Yeah. So that's a good question too. Then maybe to get into, I know you don't have as concrete of an idea of apostolic succession, but at what point maybe I don't know how you feel about women's ordination or gay marriage, but at what point do you think that that the congregation is like, I don't know, not a church anymore, or something like they haven't inherited a valid sacrament and all that kind of stuff.
So I don't think women's ordination or gay. I'm opposed to both of those things. I
Mm-hmm.
don't think women's ordination or gay marriage renders something a false church.
Mm-hmm.
The like the Protestant definition of a true church is the preaching of the word and the administration of the sacraments. And the non-Protestant definition is one holy Catholic apostolic church. Either way, there's nothing about and you gotta not be gay.
Yeah.
There's nothing about that.
Uh-huh.
So churches can be in grave error and still be true churches.
Mm-hmm.
Like even when St. Paul was writing to the churches that were doing ridiculous things, like even when the Corinthians were being more sexually immoral than the atheists in their town,
Yeah.
or the pagans rather,
Yeah.
St. Paul didn't say, you are no longer a true church. So those of you who still agree with me, you got to leave and find your own church. The church has been deeply flawed since the beginning. That's why whenever the orthobros, the Orthodox people are saying, we are like the one true, we're just like the one true church. Okay, which one true church, which early church are you like? Are you like the one in Corinth and Galatia? There's never been a time where the church has not had some big problem. So if you think a church stops doing a true church once they do something unbiblical, then there's no true church, which would make Jesus a liar.
Mm-hmm. So then, how, maybe to kind of hit back at this, why would you say that maybe the Catholic Church was enough as a Protestant? Obviously, you're not. You think there's some situation where it's like, okay, fine, you guys are teaching something that I can no longer sit in the pews for. Maybe and after we've had a long conversation about all the good stuff that the Catholic Church does today and did in history and all that kind of stuff, why would you say there's a difference there? Maybe.
Yeah, it's neither Luther nor Calvin said that Catholic churches are not true churches. They did say the Pope was the Antichrist, but they saw the Catholic churches as true churches under a dictatorship.
Yeah.
Now, I wouldn't say the Pope is the Antichrist, but what their mindset was, like, the only reason they weren't still in the Catholic Church is they got kicked out. That's why I would say, like, Calvin Robinson is not in the wrong for not being in the Church of England because he got kicked out.
Yeah.
Because you can't violate your conscience. Because Luther, he wasn't trying to start a new thing. He was just trying to preach the gospel, and he got kicked out for that. So it's like, if you get kicked out for preaching the gospel, then by all means. But if you get kicked out, make sure you try to take the institutions with you, because that's what Luther and Calvin did.
Yeah, true. I think a lot of the old churches in Europe were Catholic churches.
Yeah. So it's like, it's not that the Reformers left the Catholic Church because it wasn't a true church at all.
I see.
They still said it had marks of the true church. They left because they got kicked out for preaching the gospel. But even in most mainline churches, there's some cases of people getting kicked out, but there's also a lot of cases of people not getting kicked out for preaching the gospel. In the PCUSA, there are entire presbyteries that reject all the liberalism. Even in San Diego, which is surprising. It's California, but yeah.
I think there's more. I may be totally wrong about this. Somebody can fact check me, but I think there's a church in Philadelphia, an Episcopal church, that doesn't do gay marriages and all that kind of stuff. So
yeah, exactly. We need to strengthen those churches.
Yeah, and they're usually the large churches too. It's hard too, especially I think for Anglicans. Maybe this is again another difference because there is such a top-down organizational structure with the Episcopal Church and with Anglican tradition in general that makes it kind of hard to kind of have this reform from the bottom-up attitude, because even though those congregations are big, they still only get one priest in the canonical stuff, and they still only get like one representative vote, and it's not a democracy, I guess, or a presbytery or whatever. Then I guess my thought is, I understand that maybe that's why Luther and Calvin kind of were forced to split off. They couldn't be Catholic even though they wanted to preach the gospel to the Catholic Church. But nothing is stopping maybe us today from just joining a Catholic Church and being doctrinal Protestants and saying, in theory, obviously I think this would be impractical, but I also think it's impractical in the Episcopal Church to say, like, I'm going to show up and I'm going to just basically be a Protestant. I'm going to believe in justification by faith and not anything else, and maybe try to reform the Catholic Church from the inside. Why wouldn't you maybe advocate for that today, especially in America where Catholicism is technically the largest Christian denomination in the country?
The simple reason is, you can't be a good Catholic by doing that. It's like, I couldn't be an honest member of the Catholic Church if I won't respect the Pope as the vicar of Christ, and if I won't say a Hail Mary. like you couldn't get away with that in the Catholic Church.
Yeah.
You can get away with being a historic Protestant in the mainline church. You might have to fight at times, but you still can survive. And it's a very good thing you pointed out. It's true in the Episcopal Church, it's true in my denomination, the PCUSA. The conservative congregations are the ones that are thriving. And that's why I say I'm releasing a video in 5 minutes, actually. It's premiering
Cool.
on the Reconquista strategy. The silver bullet is the fact that liberal congregations die out and conservative ones don't. So we don't even need to necessarily advance. We just need to stick it out. It's kind of like the way Afghanistan survived being conquered by much huger
Yeah.
empires. You simply win by not losing.
Mm-hmm.
Just simply don't lose. It's the same
Yeah.
way the Americans won the Revolutionary War. Of course, Britain had a much stronger institutional hand, but
Mm-hmm.
the Americans were just like, yeah, we're just not giving up.
Mm-hmm.
So, what I would say to those in the main line, conservatives in the main line, fight like hell. Just never give
Yeah.
up. As Winston Churchill said, never surrender. So, we only have a few minutes left, but what would you say? What is your vision for how the church can like sort of reclaim institutions in the future?
Yeah, so my thought is mainly one of like prediction, like we talked earlier about Asturias and Africa and all these kinds of things. And obviously there are problems with the way that the African churches are trying to have influence over the American church. I mean, people have pointed out Uganda has some pretty archaic legal policies. But what I think is biblical and historical is the idea that will always be bastions of orthodoxy that for a time will live in exile, and that those institutions, those people, they basically play king until they can be restored to the monarchy. The example I gave in one of my videos was Charles II. So after the English Civil War, Charles I gets beheaded as a martyr. And so he stayed and died for what he believed in. And that was noble in itself too. But it was smart of Charles II, his son, to leave England and to only be restored later to the throne after sentiment changed, demographics in England changed. People got upset because the Puritans outlawed Christmas, stuff like that.
Yeah.
And so Charles II, who was in France practicing, playing king basically, like he was literally had a court and he had ceremonies, and when he got married, all of the liturgy referred to him as king, right? Even though, in England, they wouldn't have thought of him as the king of England anymore.
Yeah.
But then when he eventually was restored, he had basically kept up all of those institutions so that they could be brought in with him immediately once he took the throne again. So lords were restored, all this other kind of stuff happened instantly. So maybe my suggestion would be, right now, while I think we're in the thick, I hope it'll be a curve soon. I think demographics say that it will be kind of a let-up of liberalism in churches soon. While that is at its height, maybe we can kind of take a back burner, but with always keeping the intention ultimately to return to these places, to sit back in those pews eventually one day.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I might not 100% agree with that, but I could get behind that. I'm glad you're using kingdom analogies and care about the kingdom rather than just like radical individualism.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's probably all we have time for today. I could go into like criticisms I have of that. It's like, okay, we've tried that before. Why is this going to be different this time?
Yeah.
But you go do that, and while you do that, I'm going to be the secret agent in the enemy occupied kingdom waiting to welcome you in. So
Great. Yeah.
I'm never leaving the PCUSA, never surrender,
Yeah.
like Winston Churchill. I just don't know where else I would go. It's like I'm trapped in, it's like above, like right in front of me is like a mighty dragon that I'm not strong enough to fight. But all the other directions are blocked for me. So it's the only way.
Yeah. Hopefully we can liberate you. Maybe we'll be a little bit of a St. George. I have St. George's cross on my logo. So
all right, based.
Yeah. All right. Yeah. Okay. This was a great conversation. I appreciated it. God bless.
God bless.
Yeah.